Now we are going to attach the collar to the neckline.
All right, so we've just sewn this. Now all I've done here, so when you stitch it, it was like this. I've just trimmed away a little bit of the excess there around the curve, just so that when you, just a couple of, but half the seam allowance, and it's not all the way down to the point. Like, don't take it all the way down here, because you do need a bit of seam allowance there to be able to manipulate when you fold it through. So it's really from about 1 centimetre up, you know, like about 1.5 centimetres. So just this little bit here, I've just trimmed back, and the reason is that it makes it easier to get a nicer curve. So when I fold that through, you'll see that I've actually got a nice curve around there, but I've still got something to play with down here. I haven't chopped all that seam allowance off. Okay, so on my neckline, so this is the outside of the shirt. This is the left-hand side. So what we're going to do is we're going to start sewing at this point here. You've got a shoulder notch, so that shoulder notch is going to match up with the yoke. You've got another centre back notch, which will match up there. Another shoulder notch, and around to the right front there. Okay. Now, really important when you're starting here is to don't start over the edge. If anything, start a tiny bit back, so you can see, like it's a bit tricky to see.
Sorry,
but it's the tiniest little bit back. So this finished edge and the fold. So maybe like even 0.5 millimetre, and you'll see why.
So the collar stand is just 0.5 mil back from the
just
edge
so you can see that edge there, and I'm just positioning it
slightly
here.
Unfocused.
Yeah.
Do you,
You're right. So.
Can you just bring the piece towards me and I'll get a better? Yeah. Okay. I think you can see that better.
Yeah, so when I start sewing, I'm just going to start sewing there and curve it around. Now it is a little bit tricky, and you can see that, like this notch here, like it seems like it's not going to match up with this. If you find that the front neck, because the front neck's on the bias and it's stretching, you can actually do that thing where you put, you just sew a stay stitch around here, putting your finger behind, and it'll just gather it up just the tiniest little bit. And again, if you're having trouble with this, please see me in class, and I'll show you that little trick. Okay, but the one good thing about this is because you're sewing with a straighter edge on top, you can sort of like push this bias in under a little bit. Okay, so once you get that nicely in position, you're going to start sewing, and you really want that sewing to line up with this folded edge here. Okay, so with the folded edge. So when I put this in, okay, so I'll put it in here, and it's literally right next to that fold. Okay. So do a back tack, so don't make sure you're not sewing over that fold. Now you'll see here, it's not, my notch there isn't quite matching up here. So when you go to sew, if you actually put your hand underneath, and you can try and push the fabric in a little bit. So you're easing the fabric in. And see, it's matching up now. Just make sure that you don't end up with any tucks or anything underneath. And please, like I said, if you're having trouble doing this, talk to me or the technician, and we'll help you through this. So once we've started, I've pulled the other collar stand away, and I'm just using these two edges here. And again, you have there'll be a little bit of stretch through this neck here, but line up the center back. Because this isn't interfaced, you can also get a little bit, like pull it a little bit and match it up with that point, and then stretch it out. Just make sure the raw edges are matching. I'm just going to hook that one out there, so when I get down to the other end. So I'd probably suggest not using pins around here, because I think because the seam allowance is quite small and you have to do a lot of manipulation, I think pins would just get in the way. Now,
sometimes that seam allowance can slip away.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, now I'm already setting this up at the end here. When I get around here, and I find that this is actually fitting a lot better, which is good. And again, I have this coming around. I just want to stop the tiniest little bit back from the fold. And I'll explain why, or you'll see why I'm doing that very shortly. So when we come in, we want to stop right at that corner there as well.
We'll just zoom in on what. Can you bring that closer?
Oh, out from here.
So I can't. Yep. Okay. Okay. Cool.
Okay, so when I've stopped right at that point there.
Focus it. Yeah.
Okay. Now the idea, and I've got these black threads all over the place here, so trim those off, but it will be a lot less obvious when you're working with a matching thread. Okay, now the idea that I've stopped the tiniest little bit back, because what we're going to do now is we're going to push the seam allowance up into the collar, and then we're going to swing this edge over the top, okay? And the idea now is that because this was back a tiny bit, when you go to the outside, it actually lines up. Okay, if you have this sticking out over that edge, you'd end up with like a lump going out past the edge there. Okay.
The collar stand has to be a little bit back from the shirt front.
For your first row of stitching. Yeah. Okay. So and the idea now is that this folded edge here lines up with that row of stitching. So now we're going to put another row of stitching here to sew through all of the layers. And we'll start that. We'll go back and we'll start that at the other end. So you can see that it pulls over and then hooks around the edge there. And the reason that we've got the interfacing on the inside is because it just gives more stability around the neck. And you think, oh, you know, that interfacing should go on the outside of the collar. But the thing is, if you've got the collar done up, like you actually don't see, like you don't, like that's underneath the collar anyway. And so you just get more support around your neck if you have the interfacing on this side. And it also means that this gives you a more stable layer, you know, that you've stitched up, so it's easier to control when you're doing this row of stitching here. Okay, so that pushes up inside, twist this around.
Nice trick, Mark.
And then, another good thing to do here is, because if we just start stitching, see how like this has left a bit of a back tack there and we started stitching, like if we stitch like this, just like a regular stitch, we're actually going to end up with a lump there. So what I like to do with this stitching here is to pull the bottom thread up and pull both of those threads off to the back. Okay, so when you start stitching, and I'll show you what's happened. So right on the corner there, and do a back tack, hold those out of the way, and then just do your back tack here. Okay, and so the idea here now is that you want to, like I said, line the fold up with the stitching row that you already have there. You should be able to see your notch there, and make sure that that actually matches up with the notch. And the good thing too, because this is already sewn onto this, you can actually give that a bit of a pull so that you can neaten things up. So rather than pulling on this top layer, you might actually need to pull on the underneath layer to match things up, and just manipulate that. So I've just covered up the row of stitching with the fold, and again I've got my centre back there, so that matches up with the centre back here. And because because this is already stitched together too, like you don't have any worries about these two layers, you know, going out of whack and creating pleats. So my notch there, matching up there. So just do it bit by bit. Always, you know, when you're sewing with notches, just sew from one notch to the next. Okay, we'll come to the end here. Again, we're tucking the seam allowance up into the collar and pulling that out. Lining up our fold with a stitch line. and we'll get to the end here, and then back tack. Just trim those threads off, and I've got the tiniest little bit of a step there. And again, the reason why we've had these bits here is so that, like, when now I snip these threads off, and we get quite a nice, neat finish there. There's a tiny back tack, but it means that there are no like loose bobbin threads that are coming out underneath. Okay, so one last thing, just to neaten this up. So our collar's attached now, so it sits this way. And all I'm going to do now is just add a little bit of extra stitching along here, just because we've got it there, so we're just going to add a bit of extra stitching here on the collar stand. Okay, so we'll do it on the inside, because that's the bit that has the interfacing on it. And again, I think with this, I'm going to grab these threads and pull them around to the back. And this time, rather than starting right down on that corner, we're actually going to start here at this row of stitching. So lift the foot up if you need to, so the needle's down. You lift the foot up so you can twist it around. And this is a tricky thing I like to do as well. If you want to, you can just continue the pin stitch all the way along. But one thing that I like to do, just to be a little bit fancy, is to actually stop. When I get to the point where the stitching from the collar comes in, I twist it around and I go down 2 stitches and then hold this flat. And then I do a foot width stitch around the top here. The only thing is, when you get to the other end here, you have to make sure that it stops in the right position so that you can actually take that back up to that point again. And then around the corner. And go slowly around this corner too, because it's quite easy to go off the edge. So just do 1 or 2 stitches at a time, manipulate it. And remember, we're just going to stop stitching when we reach that line there. Okay, and so that just that row of stitching just sort of holds that little seam allowance, 6mm seam allowance, in place inside there. Okay, and then just trim off your loose threads on the back there, and oops, and the other end here, and there's our collar done. And again, it's obviously much less obvious if you're using a matching thread.